Hi there, and welcome to this recorded version of the workshop that we held a couple of weeks ago. This was the fourth in the series of four Community Research Initiative student skills development sessions. And this one was about collaborative research, project management and stakeholder relationships. So it wasn't, we didn't need people to have a CRIS partnership set up or even a collaborative dissertation. There was lots of things from this session that we made to be useful whether you were collaborating or not. So by the end of the day, we hoped that we intended that you understand that project management is as much about relationship maintenance as it is about task completion. That you are able to identify and carry out a stakeholder analysis, also a risk analysis, be able to identify your key project milestones. And actually in the session, we planned out the students who came, their project timeline from April through to September. I think at the time of the session, it was about 21 weeks from then until the end of August, start of September, which is roughly submission time. We're obviously a few weeks shorter for those of you who are watching this recording. We looked at best practice in maintaining stakeholder relationships and underpinning it all, understanding that reflection on your dissertation experience, your master's experience of juggling lots of coursework deadlines, formative and summative assessments, dissertation, whether you're collaborating or not. This is a really intensive year, but loads comes out of it. And what may be the most important thing to you at the moment is thinking about future careers and jobs and therefore interview material. So we did that in the session as well. So before we started, I had shared a Menti poll, and I asked participants who were at the session just to tell us a little bit about what were the top words that came to mind when they thought about project management. And you can see there that although there's a little bit of balancing stakeholders comes through and communication comes through, organization, time management was the big one. And that's that real things that need to be done and in what time. So at this stage, there wasn't as much emphasis on the relationship building. And also I asked, what does the term stakeholders mean to you? And I remember stakeholders being quite a new word for me many years ago when I was doing my master's. And the group offered that they understood it to be a person or a group of people whose interests are affected by the project or the partnership or the program. Any group or individual affected. Sorry, there's an airplane going over my office at the moment. All the various people involved in the project, typically representing different views that need to be aligned. I thought that was really interesting. People related to the project, all participants that involve and give impact to the project. So that was kind of the sense of what project management means and also what the term stakeholders means. And take a moment now just to think, do you identify with those kind of definitions that people have given? Do you have anything additional that you think stakeholders means? Or do you think of project management as more than that predominant time management aspect? This slide was available in an earlier session on ethical principles, but I thought it was a good idea to come back to it to help you understand why it is that I'm emphasizing the relationship maintenance and management side of things and that stakeholder idea, and that it's not just a set of tasks that need to be achieved between now and September. And actually looking at these kind of underpinning principles to good collaborative research or just good research at all, it's a lot about relationships. It's a lot about a diverse range of people. It's a lot about encouraging everyone. It's particularly collaborative research is about learning from each other, and it's a two-way learning experience. Communities, and also working together. So you can see why it's not just tasks that I'm focused on, and that's why I brought us back to this slide. And so when you think about, I wanted to start with the people rather than the project to make my point. And the person that I started with is you. And again, this is a repeat slide from previous discussions that we've had in these skill sessions. And it's thinking about kind of biases and assumptions that you might have, positions of power, and also privilege. And that idea about what makes you, you, and to think about what biases and assumptions you might have because of what makes you, you, and then relating that to the concepts of power and what power you have, and then thinking about who else might be in the room and what power they might have. And it's important to think about our privileges. As a UCL group, we are a privileged group of students and staff. So I come to any table, literal or metaphorical, as a white, straight, Scottish, British woman. And that can be a particularly powerful position to be in, depending on the room. And so it's a movable feast, and it's about just being acknowledging, especially if you're doing collaborative research, acknowledging who you are and what you bring to a room and how others might relate to you, and to be sensitive to that and think about how you relate to others because of that. So again, we revisited that during this workshop. And going broader than yourselves, thinking about stakeholders and who they are, what do they want or need, how influential are they, and how should they be involved? And this was beginning to think about a stakeholder analysis. And at the very basics of stakeholders, there's you, there's your supervisor, and if you're doing a collaborative dissertation, there's potentially a community collaborator or an organization. And I got people in the group, and this is something that you can do now as well. I find this a very important exercise to do throughout different research projects, let alone doing a dissertation project on my master's, and to think about three important things: competing priorities for each of these very basic stakeholders, the time they have available, and the importance that the project is to them. So if we think about you, what are your competing priorities to the dissertation? And they don't just need to be professional or master's related. What time have you got available? In April, a month ago, just about when we did this session, time was probably a little bit less available for the dissertation. But maybe now that you're watching this in May, times maybe you're almost at the stage when all you're doing is your dissertation. But of course, there's other things in there, whether or not you're a parent or have other caring responsibilities, whether or not you have a formal job. And the last thing is importance of the project. It is the dissertation is really important for you, but it's not the most important thing for your supervisor, probably. And it's definitely not the most important thing for your collaborator. If you think about they may well be providing a service to a very vulnerable group of citizens. This project might be interesting and helpful, but it's not at the center of what they do. So it's really good just to think about that group of three, or just two if it's you and your supervisor. There might be a PhD student involved as well, because your master's is related to a wider lab project. But ultimately, all of you have different competing priorities, different time available, and different importances of the project. And just because it's important to you doesn't mean it's important to others, but that means that you need to find ways to communicate, because it is important to you and it's what you need to fulfill over the summer. So that was a little exercise we started with. And then we also thought about the agenda. What do you all want out of this project? And I asked the workshop participants this, and for you as the student group, often it is obviously finishing the dissertation, a high quality piece of work. It might be that you want a job out of this, or it furthers your career, or a pay rise in the job you already have, for example. Sorry, again, there's a aeroplane. Your supervisor might want something different, and it came up in conversation when I mentioned it to the students, that actually maybe the supervisor, particularly an early career researcher perhaps, would encourage you strongly to co-author with them a peer-reviewed journal article, and actually a publication is what's important to some supervisors, and to support you to do that, but it's perfectly acceptable that that might be an aim for them as well. And equally for the collaborator, who probably is going to have the more different agenda. But it's really good to think, what are the benefits? What are the win-win or the win-win-win benefits for all of you working on this same project, right? Even though you're leading it and it's your dissertation. you have other stakeholders who have needs and who have agendas. So we did a stakeholder analysis, and we started off thinking about identifying your stakeholders. So who is directly involved in this project? And that was the previous exercise that we've just done. At the very base, there's you, your supervisor, and there may well be a community collaborator, individual or organization, if you have managed to set up that partnership. But it's about thinking about who are the potential beneficiaries of the research. If you were doing care home based research or dementia research, which was my research field, beneficiaries may well be the care home sector. It may well be care home managers in a particular company that you're working with. There's wider beneficiaries, and it's important to think outside of academia. Also think about, there may be stakeholders can be critical, but they can also be negatively affected potentially by what you're researching. Who directly or indirectly supports your research, and that can also be around funding, which is not an issue for you guys, but going forward to potentially PhD, there are funders who will be a really key stakeholder group. Do you have any opponents, or are there people who maybe are researching something completely different, or your theory or the theory from your lab is directly confrontational to another lab, for example, globally or nationally? So thinking about that, those are also stakeholders. And as I said before, are there any existing positive or negative relationships among your stakeholders? Sorry, I didn't say that bit before, but yes, there may well be competing interests or conflicts of interests among stakeholder groups, even though they're all interested or critical or involved in your research. This might be a little bit beyond masters, but it's the same thinking process. So we did a stakeholder analysis, which is this grid, and we thinking about who is a powerful stakeholder and also who has interest. So high or low power and high or low interest. And I asked once the workshop, students had thought about who their stakeholders were and thought broader than just yourselves and your supervisor, thinking about funders, ethics committees, collaborators, community partners, the local community, whether that's a geographical local community or whether or not it's defined by gender or race or type of service or migrant, not migrant, that kind of thing. And also other researchers in your own lab or group and externally as well. So once the students had come up with a kind of list of who they thought were their stakeholders, we plotted them onto this quadrants. And this helps tell us how and when and what we should communicate. You can see grayed out in the background there. In each quadrant is kind of advice on communicating. So thinking about people with kind of low interest but have high power, I would say I would agree with the students here. Someone like a funder, if you were being funded, they won't have, the research councils, the big research councils, the MRC or Wellcome Trust, they don't have specific high interest in your individual research, but they do have an awful lot of power over continued funding or funding for future projects. So keeping those kind of stakeholders satisfied is really important. And that's kind of detailed, regular updates and reports, and probably stakeholders like that will have their own reporting requirements. And then you've got people who have low interest but low power. Excuse me. And the students weren't super able to come up with examples of that. You have people who have high interest, but again, low power, and that will often be local communities, and the power will change there, but kind of collaborators in local communities. And you need to keep informed and keep that open dialogue with those people. And then you've got people with high interest and high power. So that's probably your supervisor and or your collaborator, and also yourself. So people with really high interest and really high power, you have to manage them closely and manage communication with them closely. And so these are different levels of relationships to think about. These are not tasks. These are relationships that you have with people depending on how close they are to the center of interest and the center of power. So a stakeholder analysis is really, I've done it for CRIS, for the Community Research Initiative. I have a big long list of people that have high interest, low interest, what level of power, and then it depends on what reports or what kind of emails I send them or events I invite them to, that kind of thing. So it's a really important thing to do. You can easily download a grid like this. Google Images has got one, but the principle is the same. You can do it in a little table that you make yourself and just plot people according to these quadrants. It'll be quite enlightening. So once we talked about people, we moved on to the project. And, very basic, 3 stages of any project. You've got your preparation, which is pretty much the longest list here. You've got kind of the delivery phase of your project, and you've got the concluding phase of your project. So generally in preparation, there's lots of planning, lots of timelines. There will be budget, although that's not relevant at master's level necessarily, mostly not, but going forward budgets. Identifying risks, what could go wrong. If in bigger projects, recruiting the team, meeting stakeholders, or certainly identifying your stakeholders, that's good preparation. Governance, like ethics, some of you have been through ethics or kind of local level stuff that you need to have those forms filled in. If you're doing a literature review, kind of identifying search terms, thinking about your databases, going on training, revisiting the session that you guys had on your course on systematic reviewing, all that kind of preparatory work. And in delivery, you're kind of monitoring, you're reporting on stuff, you're evaluating at regular intervals what's happening, you're maintaining relationships, whether that's with your supervisor, your collaborator, with wider groups, with your participants as well, if you are collecting primary data. You're managing those risks that you identified, and that's part of the monitoring as well. You're checking back with your plan. You're rearranging your plan depending on things that rise up or don't happen. Recruitment and your data collection, and like I said, the risk management. Sorry, that's a repeat. And then kind of in your conclusion, you've got your final evaluation, final report, i.e. your dissertation, publications potentially, and your findings. You actually have your findings that you then write up. So fairly self-explanatory. And some terminology that you may have heard that you may be fine with, you may not be, but thinking about kind of project outcomes. So you've got intended outcomes and outcomes. So, at the beginning when you've proposed what you're going to do, the intended outcome, so what's going to change, what's changing that you're going to measure, and those intended outcomes, the outcomes of the project might be different. So you sometimes hear about intended outcomes and then kind of actual outcomes. And outputs, same thing, intended, what you intend to produce versus what is produced. That's the difference there. The outcomes are about change during your project, and output is the product. So outcomes are your findings, well-being improved in students who took part in CRIS, for example, would be the outcome, but the output is your dissertation on that or your presentation slides on that. So your outputs are a product. That's outcomes and outputs can often be a bit confused. Milestones are your kind of key things that need to happen, and everything after it in your plan is contingent on that milestone. Ethics is a really obvious one. So you can have a project plan with everything planned out, and ethics is part of that plan. But if you don't get ethics, nothing afterwards in your timescale can happen. So that's a major milestone. Project plan, fairly obvious. Funding is not important to you. Stakeholders we've looked over. And process evaluation is an evaluation of the actual research itself. So maybe the relationship during your partnership, if you do a collaborative one, or kind of how thinking about if you're using a really long questionnaire, you might just keep an eye on how did people find that questionnaire? Did you have big drop off because it was too long, or were there any killer questions, that kind of thing. So we talked about maybe common ways that projects can go wrong when there's kind of unclear endpoints, which is less of an issue for you guys because you have a submission date. You know, even with extenuating circumstances or COVID or anything like that, you will have an endpoint. If there's not been any planning, that can be a problem. A lack of ownership, again, shouldn't be so much of a problem for you because it's your dissertation. Unclear responsibilities or roles, that can potentially be an issue if you are collaborating with an organization. Competing priorities, again, your own competing priorities, potentially competing priorities between you and collaborators. Running out of funds, not applicable to you, but it does happen. Data collection difficulties definitely can happen. Lack of leadership, poor information. So kind of various ways that projects can go wrong. And this led us to talking about a risk analysis, which is quite a good thing to do as part of your kind of planning stage. And you can even do it now. You know, you've got May, June, July, August. You've got 4 months for this project. Lots can go wrong. As you can see on the left of the screen here, you can just do a table with things that you think might go wrong. How much, the probability that you think, you know, are you 100% sure that's going to happen? Or are you 50-50 sure that's going to happen? You can rate it in terms of, you can kind of use A, B, C, D, like a school rating system, kind of what impact would that have on your project? And then don't worry about scores and stuff. You can do the same thing, excuse me, in a matrix here where you can kind of color code. So similar to the kind of stakeholder analysis of power and interest, here you've got kind of impact and probability. So something that you've identified that might go wrong, how likely is it to happen versus what impact might it have on the project if it does happen? And so red is obviously really high probability it's going to happen, and it'll have a really big impact. Okay, I just had to let a storm pass there, and we've just had a major hailstones. So I thought I would just pause the recording so that I could get through this. So yes, you can do a matrix like this where things that you think are really highly likely to happen are in red because you think they're going to have a big impact. And that's where you're going to focus your risk management during your delivery. And it's where your kind of solution finding or your contingency plan will be focused on these red bits. And then these green ones are, you've come up with them, they are possible, but they're not likely really to happen. It would be bad luck if they happened, but also if they did happen, they wouldn't cause that much bother. And you can have this bottom one is a similar to the other risk analysis, but for some reason the other way around, and also not worrying about any kind of you know, percentages and kind of ratings, more just low, medium, high. This is probably a good one to try as your first risk analysis, really. And this is what we did. We chatted a little bit about, you know, in your project, your dissertation, what might go wrong. And we thought about kind of technical, external, maybe organizational and kind of project management issues. So things like, you know, we're all working from home right now, your laptop breaking is a technical thing that might happen. You can, you know, if it's really old, then maybe it's quite probable to happen. But if it's just new, then it's probably unlikely to happen. But again, laptops can go missing or get stolen. So it's probably, you know, worth thinking about that. And a plan would be to make sure that you are backed up on the cloud, or you have lots of backups and stuff like that. For you guys in particular, things like maybe a database, not getting permissions to use a database, or there being a delay with the database, very real risk. Thinking about data collection and kind of external risks that might happen. There might be dropout of participants, not being able to find participants. This is regardless of whether or not you're doing a collaborative project. And any of you that know me know that collaborative projects are not just about finding participants, but it can be a part of it. Organizational things that go wrong. I mean, it's not unheard of that supervisors leave or become ill, for example. We had a student a couple of years ago whose supervisor had an accident and was off work for maybe 7 to 9 months. So that's probably not super likely, especially with master's students. You know, a supervisor wouldn't take on master's supervision if they knew they were leaving in the summer. But you know, it's probably super unlikely, but it would have something of an impact, although your department would obviously find you another supervisor. And then there's kind of project management issues. You might get ill, there might be a loss of time. So just thinking about what would the impact be on the project and how likely will that happen, to think about your own risks to your project. So that's something that you could do yourself. This is not super easy to see, but we had a Padlet where we asked everyone to think about, you know, what on earth could go wrong with my project. And the ones that I've highlighted here, actually, we had most of the people who came to the training, the skill session, did have a partner, community partner, and actually risk of the community partner dropping out, risk of the organisation not being able to provide access to data or interviewees, illness came up, and also data management came up. And we asked people to star rate these, and certainly these ones are the highest rated. Risks with data management, illness, and local community dropouts. And so it's not to be fearful of these risks, it's about acknowledging them, being aware of them, talking about them with your supervisor, and coming up with a contingency plan. So a plan of action if anything like this does happen. And with the partner dropout, certainly when we're setting up partnerships, what we try and do, you know, we do position the dissertation as the most important thing. And we work with the supervisor to ensure that there is a project, even if something goes drastically wrong with the organisation, because that is a reasonably real risk that something might change, personnel might change, permissions might change out with, you know, their own, you know, control. So good things to think about, because it then helps you think about solutions if these things do arise. And then the kind of main part of the session that we really seemed to be helpful for students was thinking about tasks and timings. So this is your project management, task management stuff. We did a little bit of an experiment, because I quite like thinking about this for myself, because I'm quite aware of the types of tasks. If I've done my to-do list, there's certain things that I will do over other things. There's things that I put off and kind of kick down the road a little bit to maybe next week or something. So I don't know if you can see at the top here, but thinking about kind of strategic or quite big picture, vision focused tasks. So do you like tasks that are associated with overall strategy? So you're planning and negotiating and designing, or maybe you're more interested in the kind of implementation details, getting the ethics, getting the sign-offs, getting permissions for the database, identifying people, getting consent and ethical approval, consents from them, etc. Checking out, this is less for COVID, but checking out venues, or, you know, what can and cannot happen, that kind of thing. You might be externally focused, and tasks you like that are kind of outside of your project team, or the organization, or kind of maybe even your dissertation, although it is related. Or maybe you're quite internally focused and really specific to the workings of the project itself, rather than maybe your external stakeholders. So again, on Menti, we kind of had a little bit of a play around what kind of project manager are you? And I definitely, if I had done this, I enjoy the external and kind of strategic stuff. And I would be drawn to these more than the detailed and internal things. And I've always been like that. And so it's something I'm aware of. And then I can color code my to-do list if you like. And I can also just force myself to have the kind of internal detailed to-do list that I just get through, so that I can move on to the ones that I enjoy or feel more naturally pulled towards. So the people in the group, I didn't realize this, this gives you a kind of average of the people in the group. So you can see, and quite rightly for master's students, that on the day, most people were quite detailed and internal focused. I asked people to think about 3 items on their to-do list and to plot them as to whether or not they were kind of higher in strategy or higher in detail, and were they internal to the dissertation or external. So maybe on your to-do list, you might have, you know, making applications to jobs or student, what's the word, like, you know, on fellowships and things that you want to do after your master's. You know, those are perfectly good things to do, but they're more external and they're more strategic. So maybe that's what these kind of tasks were. But brilliantly on the students' to-do lists in the week of doing this skills session was mostly detailed and internal, which is how it should be when you're doing your master's dissertation. So have a go at that. You know, have a think about what's on your to-do list and what are you actually naturally drawn to, and is there anything that is being rolled over like the lottery? Each week, is it rolling over? What are you avoiding about that task? How could you break it down to make it into tasks that you're more likely to do? It's quite a good way of working out what kind of, how do you work? So the key thing that we wanted to do, I wanted to support the students I want to support you to turn your aims and objectives. You've all had to write something of a proposal with an aim of your study, or maybe a research question or a problem that you've had to define, with a bunch of objectives that you're going to meet those objectives in order to be able to answer a question or meet the aim that you've set or solve the problem. And so the key here as project management is that you turn those things into a list of tasks, much smaller bite-sized tasks, and you overlay a time frame on that. And that is your key to project management. So start backwards. My top tips are to start and work backwards. So give yourself, when is it that you have to hand what's your submission date? And that's what I did for the students. What's the submission date? How many weeks are there until then? So that's your time frame. Separately, draw up all your tasks, and then you start filling them into your time frame. So the trick is to be specific and to use verbs, you know, what needs to be done. So, you know, I worked through an example of, you know, you might add onto your task list, which you may well have this as maybe an interim poster presentation that you have to do to your classmates and colleagues. You have to present a poster. So that covers loads, right? If you just think about this bottom little table here, first of all, you have to, within that, you have to confirm the poster content, or what are your findings, or what is it that you're presenting. So those decisions need made. So maybe decide content is a task within present poster. You've got to design the poster. You've got to identify printers or book a printer, or, you know, I was kind of riffing with this. You have to send your poster to the printers. You may have to collect your poster. This is a little bit old school, is what I had to do, but it's probably all, you know, I'm sure it would just be emailed to you. And you'd print it out yourself, say. But yeah, if you're getting one of these massive A0 posters, generally you send that off to some repro guys, and they will print that poster for you. And then you have to, say, practice your poster presentation. So all those tasks are within that present poster. So when you're thinking about a time frame and when you have to do things, and what leads on to something else, and what needs done, so all these things need done before you can present poster. So you need to flesh out your kind of project planning timeline so that each thing that falls within present poster is covered and has a date stamp on it. I'm doing this in week 3, and then in week 4 I'll collect my poster, and then in week 5 is when I'm actually presenting it. So what I did was, this is basically what you may have heard of Gantt charts. The students hadn't in the workshop, but a Gantt chart essentially is the list of things that needs done with a timeline. And you can get, I'm sure there's apps, you can certainly get lots of clever software that does this. Just use Excel. This is this is one of my own from a previous project a couple of years ago. It was supposed to be a very brief outline, hence why mine is not very detailed. And so I'm kind of going against what I've just told you, but this is just Excel. So made an Excel list of things that had to be done, gave myself a timeline, and then you use the shading function, and you shade in generally in black. You can make it as colorful, as lovely as you want to. You fill in the time frames that you're giving yourself to do each of the tasks. Okay. And so the exercise that we did in the workshop, and these materials will be available to you where you've found this recording, I started off an Excel Gantt chart for the students, and in a workshop, they actually started planning their dissertation there and then. They thought about the 21 weeks that I'd given them on the Excel sheet. Probably start off with your literature review background. Ethics is probably not going to be applicable to you now that we're into the first week of May. But in groups, I got just have a think about what is it that you have to do and have them nice and specific, really break down your tasks and then give yourself a timeline. So develop your task list, number one, group your tasks, and they generally will fall under your kind of bold, you'll see this when you look at the template, the kind of bold headings through your task list will probably theme under your kind of objectives, the things that you want to do. So one of your objectives might be, present poster at a conference, for example, thinking about that I've just chatted through with you. So, your objectives will be in bold, and then all the little tasks that are needed in order to do that objective. And then those objectives are related to your aim. So you can see that your big long list of tasks are just an even more subdivided way of getting to answering your research question, meeting your research aim, or solving your research problem. Put them in order, like there's a sequence to all these tasks that you've come up with. There's probably a sequence to your objectives. Identify key milestones, so things like ethics, or you need supervisor sign off, you need to do an interim report or an interim presentation around June. Generally, that's a good idea to force yourself to do stuff like that because it gives you something to work towards. Or maybe you are using data from your collaborative partner and there's a particular date that they're going to anonymize it by. That's a pretty major milestone and one to keep an eye on. And then you add your timeline. I would suggest weeks. So I guess it must be maybe 18-ish weeks from now. Maybe through August. And a little bit in September, if you do have a bit of an extension or extenuating circumstances, I might subdivide that into even days. I've seen myself, particularly writing up my PhD, I've seen myself with half days. I've got to that level of this half of the day, I need to finish this part of this chapter. This half of the day, I need to do this. And just really subdivide yourself down as much as you want. So you can explode your timeline. You can have each cell in Excel is a week, and then hit August, and then just make each cell August week 1, August 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is week 1, and it's all the days in week 1. Week 2 is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that kind of thing. So just explode out your time frame and be flexible. Your timeline can shift. So this is not written in stone, but you come back to this and you shift things around and you check what's happening, but the milestones are what anchor your timeline. And actually the good thing about this is what it shows you is the kind of mass of black is the mass of activity and the mass of what you're doing. So you can see, in year 2, in months 1 to 6, this is obviously a massively basic time frame. There was 1, 2, 3, there was 4 things that I was doing. Something was being delivered. This was about care homes. I was doing interim evaluation. I was rolling it out to all the providers' care homes, and I was doing stakeholder interviews. So that was pretty busy, say. And as it was exploded out, you would see that black kind of not be so condensed. And it's a good way of identifying, oh, wow, that week is really busy. And the example that I gave to the students in red on the top, I put kind of personal stuff. So maybe you've got to go to your sister's wedding during the summer. I would put that in and like maybe little red squares at the top. And if you are going away for 2 weeks to your sister's wedding and you're not doing work, then there shouldn't be any black squares in the timeline underneath that. So it's a good way. I quite often will add in the major kind of personal stuff that's happening. If you're moving flats, June, end of June is maybe when your flat changes. You might be moving back home if you're an international student. I would put those things in the top of your Gantt chart just so you've got that relativity of stuff that does need to be done and stuff on your dissertation that needs to be done. So there's a relationship there. You're not a robot. So if you go online where you found this recording, you'll find the Gantt chart that I've started for you, and give that a whirl and see if that helps you with your planning and kind of timelining. There it is here. So this is what the students did. You can see the red stuff at the top. Maybe you've still got a bit of coursework to do. Maybe you've got an internship over the summer, and here's that sister's wedding. So I popped them in red. You know, maybe you have to go to library training for your literature review. Probably a milestone, not a major milestone, because you could still do it without the training. But you know, it's good to put some emphasis on that. Maybe you have to have an absolute confirmation with supervisor. Your supervisor won't let you do anything until they've signed off your literature review strategy, for example. So that's what the MSs mean. So you can see here that I started it off with the whole thing's your dissertation, one section's your literature review, one section's an objective 1 or 2, I don't know why, oh yeah, 2 and 3 I've put in there, sorry, and then each task within. And then I've put in the dates along the top all the way to the end of August, which is possibly a bit frightening looking at that, how little time there is. But also, hopefully you don't have anything else to do, particularly on your course. And so it should feel luxurious compared to all the coursework you've been doing. So have a practice at really breaking down. Look how I've broken down this literature review. So you're not just writing do literature review, or even, you know, identify databases. I'm talking about search terms here, checking in with the supervisor, running searches. You might have a week where you're just running searches, and the management that comes with different databases, different searches, different search terms, and what the hits are. You know, when you're going to do your title abstract search, when are you going to confirm the flow diagram. So yeah, have a go at that, see if that helps. And it's nothing more fancy than an Excel spreadsheet, and this will be your best friend if it works for you. The last thing that we talked about was that collaboration needs communication. You'll be bored of me saying communication skills, but certainly for you guys this year, it'll be mostly email and mostly video meetings that you'll be having with your supervisor, with any participants, or with any collaborators. And so we talked about making your meetings count. Maybe work out the scheduling now, work out the preferred dates for you and your supervisor and potentially your collaborator, you know, when to avoid, how regularly, set that up now and get that into your Gantt chart, because that will give you, it will enforce you to do something. If you have one meeting a month with your supervisor, that will be a milestone to work towards that will keep you ticking over. Like I said in the second point, hold yourself accountable by scheduling these and having to do something for each meeting. Do an agenda, even if it's just you and your supervisor. It's really good practice to do an agenda, include the actions from last week. Maybe your supervisor had some actions, maybe it was all you, but you know, it's really good to practice using agendas and last actions and reviewing what's been done. Circulate that in good time. You know, what is that? Is it a week in advance? Is it a month in advance? Which would be a bit difficult. And it's everybody's, if you are collaboration, it is everybody's agenda. So invite other people to, you know, this is a proposed agenda that I would like, these are things I'd like to talk through when we next meet. Anyone want to add anything, and then add those things in. It should be a shared thing. Chair it well. I would suggest that you take this role. That might not be the case. If it's just you and your supervisor may well use it as a checking in, what are you doing, how's things going. They may well chair it. Take minutes. One of the real benefits of everything being online is if your supervisor and any others who are in the meeting agree, I would record your meetings. Just means that you can just be there and be present and not be thinking about taking notes. I remember doing my master's and also PhD, and I would come out of meetings and I just, you know, the stuff that my supervisor had been saying I knew was gold, but you know, I couldn't replicate it exactly. And not that that's your job, but it is really nice, I think, to be able to go back and just remind yourself the context in which you were talking, and you can never take notes and truly capture, or I can't anyway. So either take minutes, but I would ask whether or not you can record your meetings, and it's just for your use to check back in on. Well, assign actions to people. Actions have owners, and circulate minutes. They're also a shared experience. So if you've written up notes, share it with your supervisor if that's just who it is, or others, and say, this is my best representation of the meeting. I hope it captures it for you. Do add anything if it doesn't, and also do follow-ups. Check in with actions and people that are doing things and how things are going. So we talked about really making meetings count. And then we've thought about the kind of project materials and who has access to what and how you might manage data. So not just data like answers to surveys, but kind of all your project materials. And what could those project materials be? You might have an agreed proposal document that you've handed in as part of your course. So you and your supervisor have got access to that. You might have a research collaboration agreement if you do have a partnership, and everybody should have access to that. You might have personal reflections. There might be kind of governance materials like ethics, data collection tools, etc. And so if everybody should have access to that, think about either a team space, think about Dropbox or Google Docs, although you need to be careful with GDPR and ethics around things like that if you're working with someone outside of the university. So those are all things that as a project manager, you would be managing those things. And finally, something that I would strongly recommend, especially if you're collaborative, is to have an official end of project meeting. And although I've put this down, the list here, really this is to thank the team. And the second thing is it's about celebrating completion. You've got to celebrate what you've done. It's really important to celebrate working together, getting to an end point, whatever that end point is. So I would suggest scheduling this now, especially if you have a collaborative person involved. It's for celebrating, it's for reviewing the outcomes. Does your research show what you guys hypothesized that it would? Was well-being of students better who used an advice service than didn't? It's a good way to do that kind of process evaluation or evaluate the collaboration, what worked well, what didn't. That's maybe a bit confronting. It might be a bit difficult face-to-face, but trying to think about a way of capturing that. Instead of the end of project meeting, or as well as if on your master's program there's a kind of end of year presentation of dissertation results and findings and things, ask if your collaborator can come. If you had a collaborator and they would benefit from that, ask your course whether or not an external person can come. So that might be a really nice way to have an end of project meeting. They may well be allowed, you could ask if they can present as part of your dissertation presentation, if it's a really kind of co-created piece of work that you've been able to do. And then finally, we ended on reflection being your interview friends. And we just were reflecting on kind of really common, you can Google this, if you're going for research, any kind of research assistant jobs or anything to do with impact or evaluation or research or new knowledge creation or synthesizing knowledge. That's what literature reviews are. That's what we can all do as academics. We were thinking about key interview questions, common interview questions that you can find online, and then thinking about how a dissertation or your master's year or your collaboration can really go a long way towards giving you really rich answers to those questions. So, that first one there, this job requires project management skills. Tell us about a time when you've managed a project from its inception to completion. What were the challenges and how did you overcome them? Quite a basic question. You can now talk about stakeholder analysis. You can talk about risk analysis. You can now talk about Gantt charts and turning aims and objectives into a timed task list. So you could do a really rich answer to that. Tell us about a time when you had to communicate with different audiences. Describe the key ways you adapted your communication. Again, the stakeholder analysis stuff, if you do a bit more reading around that would give you you wouldn't send a really detailed report that you would send to a funder. You wouldn't send that to the local community group made up of people of the same kind that you're working with. So you adapt what you're telling them, yeah? So yeah, these were kind of 4 questions that we talked through that really you will have loads of lovely stuff to be able to say, not just because of your experience, not because you've gone and had to think ages about interview questions. So think about doing a bit of reflection. Certainly going forward, we're looking to encourage CRIS students to keep a kind of CRIS journey diary kind of thing. And the only reason I'm asking to do that is, one, it helps students with reflection, and at the end of the year you would have a nice little list of reflections of experiences that you've had that you can then turn into answers for interviews. So the students that came on the day strongly agreed with learning something new and useful today, or agreed. So I really hope that this recorded session has done the same thing. You can contact me on CRIS, C-R-I-S, at ucl.ac.uk over the summer if you would like to. I also have a link to to book an appointment if you want to talk through dissertation, collaboration, project management type stuff. Yeah, do feel free to get in touch, and I hope you found something useful today. Thanks very much.